The sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills stood as a testament to Karim al-Rashid's success, its modern architecture blending seamlessly with traditional Middle Eastern elements. Yet, despite its grandeur, the 45-year-old business mogul felt increasingly isolated within its walls. The morning sun filtered through the ornate windows, casting intricate shadows across the marble floors as Karim sat at his massive dining table, absently stirring his untouched coffee. His personal assistant, Marcus, stood nearby with a tablet in hand, reviewing the day's schedule. "Sir, we have 3 candidates for the chef position arriving today. All come highly recommended, with extensive experience in Middle Eastern cuisine." Karim nodded without enthusiasm. This would be the 4th chef he'd hired this year. The others had all disappointed him, some with their lack of skill, others with their apparent fascination with his wealth. In his experience, people always wanted something from him, and he'd grown weary of their transparent attempts to curry favor. "Their backgrounds have been thoroughly vetted?" he asked, his accent barely noticeable after years of international business dealings. "Of course, sir. The first candidate, Sarah Chen, trained in Dubai for 5 years. The second, Isabella Martinez, comes from a 3-star Michelin restaurant in New York. And the third, Amira Hassan, has been a private chef for several prominent families in London." Karim's attention caught on the last name. "Hassan? That's not a common surname in London." "She was adopted by a British family as an infant, sir. Her background check shows a clean record, excellent references, and no connection to any tabloids or press." The morning dragged on as Karim interviewed the candidates. Sarah Chen was technically proficient, but lacked the warmth he sought in his traditional dishes. Isabella Martinez spoke more about her celebrity clients than her cooking. Then Amira Hassan entered his study, and something about her presence made him pause. She was younger than the others, perhaps in her early 30s, with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her age. Her dark eyes held a depth of experience that intrigued him, and when she spoke about food, it wasn't with the rehearsed precision of a trained chef, but with genuine passion. "Cooking isn't just about following recipes," she explained, her British accent soft and measured. "It's about understanding the soul of the dish, the history behind it. When I make kabsa, I'm not just combining rice and spices. I am creating something that brings people together, that reminds them of home." Karim found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite his usual skepticism. "And where is home for you, Miss Hassan?" A flicker of something, pain perhaps, crossed her face before she smiled. "Home is wherever I'm cooking, Mr. Al-Rashid. My adopted parents gave me a wonderful life in London, but I've always felt most at peace in a kitchen, creating dishes that tell stories." He hired her on the spot, surprising both Marcus and himself. Yet as he watched her leave his study, a familiar suspicion crept in. Her story seemed too perfect, her manner too genuine. In his experience, such perfection often masked ulterior motives. That evening, while reviewing security footage, a habit he developed after years of dealing with untrustworthy employees, Karim made a decision. He would put Amira Hassan to the test. If she was truly as genuine as she appeared, she would pass. If not, well, he learned long ago that it was better to expose deception early. "Marcus," he called, his voice echoing through the intercom, "have the security team install additional cameras in the east wing, and bring me the combination to the private safe in the study." "Sir?" Marcus's confusion was evident in his voice. "I'm going to leave it open," Karim explained, a grim smile playing across his features. "Let's see what our new chef does when temptation presents itself." As night fell over the mansion, Karim stood at his bedroom window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. For a moment, he caught his reflection in the glass. A successful man by all measures, yet one whose wealth had built walls instead of bridges. He pushed the thought aside. Trust had to be earned, and he would make sure Amira Hassan earned hers. Little did he know that his test would uncover secrets far more personal than he could have imagined. Secrets that would shake the very foundation of his carefully constructed world. Amira's first week at the mansion transformed the kitchen from a sterile, unused space into a warm sanctuary filled with the aromatic whispers of cardamom, saffron, and za'atar. Each morning she arrived before sunrise, her movements precise and purposeful as she prepared Karim's breakfast. Through the hidden cameras, he watched her work, searching for signs of duplicity, but finding only dedication. The test he'd devised was simple, but effective. In his study, the safe stood partially open, its contents, stacks of $100 bills and priceless jewelry, visible to anyone who entered. Additionally, he'd left several valuable items carelessly strewn about the mansion. A Rolex watch on the kitchen counter, a diamond-encrusted pen in the library, an envelope of cash protruding from a drawer. On her third day, Amira encountered the watch while preparing lunch. Through the cameras, Karim observed her reaction with keen interest. She simply picked it up, placed it on a higher shelf away from her cooking area, and continued chopping vegetables. When Marcus came to retrieve it later, she mentioned its location without a hint of hesitation. "Your employer might want to be more careful with his belongings," she said with a gentle smile. "The steam from cooking isn't good for fine timepieces." Karim found himself increasingly fascinated by her behavior. Unlike previous employees who had fawned over his wealth or tried to ingratiate themselves, Amira maintained a respectful but genuine demeanor. She spoke when spoken to, her responses thoughtful and direct, but never attempted to engage in unnecessary conversation or venture beyond her duties. One evening, as Karim sampled her majbouz, the rich spices transported him back to his childhood in Saudi Arabia. The taste was so authentic, so perfectly balanced, that he found himself asking, "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Amira paused in her work, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face. "I had dreams," she said softly, "of finding my birth mother through food. I learned every Middle Eastern recipe I could, thinking perhaps, but that was a long time ago. Now I cook because it's the closest I can come to understanding where I came from." Her words stirred something in Karim, a long-buried memory of family whispers and closed doors from his youth. He dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. Years of business dealings had taught him that emotional manipulation was a common tactic. Yet, watching her through the cameras as she worked late into the night, perfecting dishes for the next day, he saw no signs of calculation in her actions. The safe remained untouched, the valuable items unmolested. If anything, Amira seemed to go out of her way to protect his belongings, always carefully moving them aside or alerting Marcus to their presence. Her indifference to his wealth was beginning to make Karim uncomfortable, not because it confirmed his suspicions, but because it challenged them. 2 weeks into her employment, Karim decided to escalate the test. He arranged for a particularly valuable piece to be displayed in the hallway leading to the kitchen, an antique necklace of exceptional craftsmanship, its golden filigree work characteristic of traditional Middle Eastern artistry. On the morning he set this final test, Karim watched the security feed with unusual anticipation. Amira entered the hallway carrying fresh groceries, her step light and purposeful as always. Then she saw the necklace. The bags slipped from her hands, produce scattering across the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. Her face, always composed, crumpled with an emotion so raw it made Karim lean closer to the screen. She approached the necklace with trembling hands, not touching it but staring as if seeing a ghost. "It can't be," he heard her whisper through the audio feed. "Mother's necklace. How?" Karim felt the world tilt beneath him. The necklace had been in his family for generations, passed down through the maternal line. His mother had told him it was lost decades ago, around the same time that... He switched off the security feed, his hands shaking as decades of carefully constructed certainty began to crumble. The truth he was beginning to suspect would change everything, not just for him, but for the young woman who had entered his home as an employee, and might, he now realized, be something else entirely. Something that would force him to confront the carefully hidden secrets of his own family's past. The following days in the mansion took on a dreamlike quality. Karim found himself obsessively reviewing old family photographs, searching for clues he might have missed. The necklace incident had awakened something in him, a nebulous memory of hushed conversations and his mother's tears during a particular summer when he was 12. In his private study, he spread decades-old documents across his mahogany desk. His father's business dealings had taken them across continents, their life a whirlwind of luxury hotels and private jets. But that summer, they had unexpectedly settled in London for 3 months. His mother had seemed different afterward, more distant, her eyes often lost in thought. Marcus entered with the morning reports, pausing at the unusual sight of his employer surrounded by old papers. Sir, shall I reschedule your meetings for today? Karim waved him off, his attention fixed on a yellowed envelope. No, but I need you to do something else. Find everything you can about Amira Hassan's adoption, birth records, adoption agency, anything. Sir, that might be legally complicated. Then make it legally uncomplicated, Karim interrupted, his voice sharp with urgency. And Marcus, be discreet. I don't want her to know we're looking into this. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Amira moved through her daily routine like a sleepwalker. Her hands performed their tasks automatically, kneading dough, chopping herbs, stirring sauces. But her mind repeatedly returned to the necklace. She had seen it only once before, in a worn photograph her birth mother had managed to send to the orphanage years ago. The accompanying note had explained its significance. A family heirloom passed down through generations of women in her maternal line. During her lunch break, she sat in the garden away from the security cameras she'd noticed throughout the house. From her apron pocket, she withdrew the photograph, creased and soft from years of handling. The image showed a young woman holding a baby, the golden necklace gleaming at her throat. On the back, in faded ink, "My beloved daughter, never forget you are loved, Samira." Inside the mansion, Karim was reaching a breaking point. The more he investigated, the more questions arose. His mother, Samira al-Rashid, had always been a private woman, but now he wondered how much of that privacy had been devoted to keeping secrets. He remembered asking about the necklace once years ago, and her evasive answer about losing it during their travels. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Karim found himself drawn to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway watching Amira work. Her movements reminded him so much of his mother. The way she held her wrist while chopping, the subtle tilt of her head as she tasted a sauce. "The necklace," he said quietly, making her start. "The one in the hallway, you recognized it." Amira's hands stilled on the counter. For a long moment, only the gentle bubbling of a pot on the stove broke the silence. When she turned to face him, her composure was intact, but her eyes held a mix of fear and hope that made his chest tighten. "Yes," she answered simply. "I've seen it before in a photograph. It belonged to my birth mother." Karim stepped into the kitchen, his heart pounding. "This photograph, do you have it?" With trembling hands, Amira withdrew the worn picture from her pocket. Karim took it, and the world seemed to stop. The woman in the photograph was unmistakably his mother, 30 years younger, but with the same graceful bearing he remembered from his childhood. The baby in her arms couldn't be him. He had never been that small during their time in London. "Your birth mother's name," he whispered, though he already knew the answer. "Was it Samira?" Amira nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "Samira al-Rashid. I've tried for years to find her, but all records seem to lead to dead ends. The adoption agency told me the family had moved back to Saudi Arabia, but by then," Karim sank into a nearby chair, the photograph clutched in his hand. All the suspicious tests he'd devised, the cameras he'd installed, they seemed ridiculous now, petty exercises in control, when the real truth had been standing right in front of him, cooking his meals and speaking to his heart through the familiar spices of his childhood. "I need to make a call," he said abruptly, standing up. "Stay here, please, just stay." He walked to his study in a daze, his phone already in his hand. There was only one person who could confirm what he now suspected. One person who had been there that summer in London and knew all his mother's secrets. With shaking fingers, he dialed his Aunt Fatima's number in Riyadh, praying she would finally tell him the truth about the sister he never knew he had. The phone rang 5 times before Fatima answered. At the sound of her familiar voice, Karim felt like a child again, seeking answers to questions he didn't fully understand. "Aunt Fatima," he said in Arabic, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I need to ask you about London, about the summer when I was 12. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that he thought the connection had failed. Then he heard her soft sigh. "You found her, didn't you?" The simple question confirmed everything. Karim gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. "Why didn't anyone tell me? I had a sister, have a sister, and everyone kept it from me." "Your mother," Fatima began, her voice heavy with old grief. "She didn't have a choice, Habibi. Your father, you know how traditional he was. When she became pregnant again, unmarried." "Unmarried?" Karim interrupted, confused. They were separated that year, your parents. Your father had filed for divorce, though they reconciled later. But during that time, your mother, she found comfort with someone else. When she discovered she was pregnant, your father had just proposed reconciliation. She knew he would never accept another man's child. The truth crashed over Karim in waves. His perfect family image, carefully maintained through years of social appearances and business successes, began to crack. He remembered his father's stern face, his rigid adherence to tradition and reputation. So she gave away her daughter, he said frankly. She made sure the baby would be safe and loved, Fatima corrected gently. She chose the adoptive family herself, good people in London. She kept track of her daughter from afar, sent what messages she could. The necklace, she wanted to give it to her daughter one day. But after your father discovered she'd kept it, Karim closed his eyes, remembering the sudden disappearance of the necklace, his mother's quiet sadness. Does she know? My mother? Is she aware that Amira is here? No, Fatima replied. After your father's passing, she wanted to find her daughter, but too much time had passed. The adoption agency had closed, records were sealed. She still searches in her own way. In the kitchen, Amira continued her work, though her hands shook slightly as she prepared dinner. The systematic clicking of security cameras reminded her that she was being watched, but for once she didn't mind. Let him watch. Let him see that regardless of what happened next, she would conduct herself with dignity. She had almost convinced herself that she was imagining things, that the necklace was just a coincidence, that her desperate search for connection had led her to see patterns where none existed. Then she heard Karim's footsteps returning to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway, looking somehow both more vulnerable and more imposing than ever. In his hands he held a small device and what appeared to be a medical kit. I need to know, he said quietly, with absolute certainty. Would you consent to a DNA test? Amira looked at the kit, then back at him. You believe it too, then, that we might be siblings, he finished. Yes, I'm beginning to believe it. My aunt just confirmed that my mother had a daughter born in London, given up for adoption. The timing matches, the necklace matches. But I need to be sure. She nodded, understanding his caution. Hadn't she spent years being careful, methodically tracking down every lead, every possible connection to her birth family? Yes, she said. I consent. The next few minutes passed in charged silence as they followed the DNA test instructions. When it was done, Karim sealed the samples carefully. I have a private lab, he explained. They can have results within hours. Until then, I should prepare dinner, Amira said firmly, turning back to her workstation. Whatever the results, you still need to meet. Karim found himself smiling despite the tension. Her practical approach, so like his own, made him wonder how he hadn't seen the connection sooner. Very well, but please, join me for dinner tonight. I think we have a lot to talk about. As he left the kitchen, Karim sent the DNA samples with his most trusted driver to the lab. The next few hours would change everything, or nothing. Either way, he realized he no longer viewed Amira with suspicion. Whether she turned out to be his sister or not, she had already begun to break down the walls he'd built around his heart. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a message from his aunt. Your mother is coming to visit next week. She says she has something important to tell you. I think it's time, Habibi. Time for all the secrets to end. The mansion's formal dining room had never felt so intimate. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the long table where Karim and Amira sat, an elaborate spread of Middle Eastern dishes between them. For the first time, Amira occupied a chair rather than serving the meal, though she couldn't help adjusting the placement of dishes with professional precision. Tell me about your childhood, Karim said, breaking the thick silence. Your adoptive family. Were they good to you? Amira smiled, relaxing slightly. The Hassans were wonderful. Are wonderful. They never tried to hide that I was adopted or suppress my curiosity about my heritage. My adoptive mother, Elizabeth, even learned to cook Middle Eastern cuisine so I would feel connected to my roots. And yet you became a chef, Karim observed, serving himself some stuffed grape leaves that Amira had prepared. Food was my way of searching, she admitted, watching him taste her cooking with new significance. Every recipe I mastered felt like a message I could send backward through time. Silly, perhaps, but I always hoped my birth mother would somehow taste my food and know me. Karim set down his fork, touched by the poetry of her words. It worked in a way. Your cooking, it reminds me so much of our mothers. The first time I tasted your food, it felt like being transported back to my childhood. The word our hung in the air between them, still tentative but full of possibility. The DNA results wouldn't arrive until morning, but something deeper than science was already connecting them. Shared mannerisms, similar expressions, the way they both methodically organized their plates as they ate. What was she like? When you were growing up, Karim's expression softened. Elegant but warm. She could command a room full of diplomats and businessmen, then spend hours telling me bedtime stories. She loves poetry, keeps journals full of verses she's written, and she has this laugh. He paused, swallowing hard. When she really laughs, it's like music. But after that summer in London, she laughed less. Because of me, Amira said, her voice barely a whisper. Because of father, Karim corrected firmly. His rigid beliefs, his obsession with appearance and tradition. Mother tried to protect both of us. Me from the truth, you from his judgment. Aunt Fatima said she chose your adoptive family carefully, stayed informed about your life as much as she could. Amira reached into her pocket and withdrew the worn photograph, placing it on the table between them. This was all I had of her. One picture and a name. I hired private investigators over the years, but the trail always went cold in Saudi Arabia. Now I understand why. The Al-Rashid family's privacy would have been impenetrable. He built walls to keep the world out, Karim acknowledged, thinking of his own suspicious nature, the cameras still recording their every move. I became like my father in many ways, controlling, distrustful, until you arrived and began breaking down those walls one meal at a time. Their conversation flowed more easily as dinner progressed, years of separation dissolving in shared stories and discovered similarities. Karim learned that Amira shared his mother's love of poetry, keeping her own journal of verses. Amira discovered that her methodical nature, which she'd attributed to her culinary training, was a family trait, evident in how Karim organized his business empire. As the evening drew to a close, Marcus appeared discreetly in the doorway. "Sir, your mother's travel arrangements have been confirmed. Her flight arrives tomorrow evening." The siblings exchanged glances, the weight of tomorrow's revelations settling over them. Not only would the DNA results arrive, but they would face the woman who connected them, who had carried this secret for so long. "Stay here tonight," Karim said suddenly. "There's a guest suite in the East Wing. It's too late for you to drive home, and tomorrow..." He trailed off, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions about what tomorrow might bring. Amira understood. "Thank you. I'd like that." Later that night, unable to sleep, Karim found himself drawn to the kitchen. To his surprise, Amira was there, methodically kneading dough with the soft light above the center island. "Couldn't sleep either," he asked, settling onto a bar stool. "Baking helps me think," she replied, her hands never stopping their rhythmic motion. "Mother's kitchen. What did it smell like?" "Cardamom," Karim answered immediately. She always had cardamom pods in her pockets, crushed them between her fingers when she was deep in thought. "And orange blossoms. Her favorite tea. Orange blossom and mint," Amira finished with him, their shared knowledge bringing matching smiles to their faces. They stayed there until dawn, talking softly, baking together, building a bridge across 30 years of separation. When the sun rose, bringing with it the promise of DNA results at their mother's arrival, they were ready to face it together. No longer employer and employee, no longer strangers, but family, finding their way back to each other. The early morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the results of Karim and Amira's sleepless night. Fresh bread cooled on racks, the aroma of cardamom and orange blossom lingering in the air. They sat at the kitchen island, cradling cups of mint tea, when Marcus entered with an envelope from the lab. Karim held the envelope, his usual decisiveness deserting him. "Would you like to..." He offered it to Amira. She shook her head, wrapping her hands tighter around her teacup. "You do it. Please." With careful movements, Karim opened the envelope and unfolded the results. His hands trembled slightly as his eyes scanned the document. After a moment that felt like eternity, he looked up, meeting Amira's anxious gaze. 99.9% match, he said softly. "You are my sister." The words hung in the air between them, transforming their world. Amira's teacup clattered against its saucer, As she set it down, her composure finally breaking. Tears spilled down her cheeks as years of searching, hoping, and wondering culminated in this moment of certainty. Karim moved around the island, pulling her into an embrace that felt both foreign and familiar. "Little sister," he whispered, his own eyes damp. "All this time you were right here." They spent the morning in a daze of shared stories and discoveries. Karim cleared his schedule, delegating urgent matters to Marcus. Amira called the Hassans, her adopted parents, sharing the news with them amid tears and laughter. "They want to meet you," she told Karim after ending the call. "They've always encouraged my search, always supported me. Elizabeth said she'd suspected something when she saw your name in the news years ago, but couldn't be certain." "I'd like that," Karim replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "They gave you a home, love, security. They're part of our family too now." As afternoon approached, the siblings found themselves in the mansion's grand foyer, preparing for their mother's arrival. Karim had sent his private jet to bring her from Saudi Arabia, unable to wait for regular flight arrangements. "Should we tell her we know?" Amira asked, adjusting and readjusting a vase of flowers. "Or let her tell us in her own time?" Karim considered this, watching his sister's nervous movements. "Let's wait," he decided. "She's carried this secret for so long. She should have the chance to share it her way." They had just finished making preparations when Marcus appeared, looking somewhat flustered. "Sir, there's been a slight change. Your mother's flight landed early. She's already on her way. Her car just passed through the main gates." Amira's eyes widened in panic. "I should go to the kitchen, prepare dinner." "No." Karim caught her arm gently. "Stay. You belong here." The sound of car tires on gravel reached them. Through the foyer's windows, they watched a sleek black car approach. Amira's hand found Karim's, squeezing tightly. Together, they stood at the top of the entrance steps as the car door opened. Samira al-Rashid emerged, still elegant as ever in her silk headscarf and tailored dress. She looked up at the mansion, then froze as her gaze fell on the two figures waiting for her. Her hand flew to her throat, where a space had been empty for 30 years, missing the weight of a gold necklace she had given away with her daughter. "Karim!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. Then her eyes locked on Amira, and time seemed to stop. "Oh, Allah be praised," she whispered. "My Amira." She swayed slightly and both her children moved as one, descending the steps to support her. As they reached her, she gathered them both in her arms, 3 decades of separation dissolving in tears, and whispered prayers of gratitude. "My children," she said in Arabic, her voice thick with emotion. "My precious children." Together at last. Around them the garden's fountains played their gentle music, and the afternoon sun cast their shadows as one upon the ground. Inside the mansion, cameras still recorded silently, but they no longer watched for deceit. Instead, they captured a moment of healing, of family bonds strengthened rather than broken by the weight of truth. Marcus quietly directed the staff to give the family privacy, but not before witnessing Samira cup her daughter's face in her hands, tracing features she had memorized in infancy. "You have your grandmother's eyes," she said softly. "I've dreamed of telling you that for so long." The family moved to the mansion's intimate sitting room, where Samira sat between her children, unable to stop touching them, as if confirming their presence was real. Afternoon light filtered through gossamer curtains, casting a gentle glow over their room. "I have so much to tell you both," Samira began, her fingers intertwined with Amira's while her other hand rested on Karim's arm. "So many years of silence to break. We know some of it," Karim said gently. "Aunt Fatima told us about that summer in London." Samira's eyes filled with tears. "Fatima, of course, she was my strength through it all. But there's so much more you should understand." She turned to Amira, her voice softening. "Your father, he was a poet I met in London, Abdullah Rahman. He wrote verses that could make the stars weep. We found each other during a time when I thought my life was ending, when your father," she glanced at Karim, "and I was separated. Did he know about me?" Amira asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He never knew," Samira replied sadly. "By the time I discovered I was expecting you, he had returned to Lebanon. And then your father," she squeezed Karim's hand, "proposed reconciliation. I made choices that hurt so many people, trying to protect everyone." "You don't have to explain," Amira assured her, though tears streamed down her face. "The Hassans gave me a wonderful life. They made sure I knew I was loved. Tell me about them, Samira urged. Tell me everything. I received reports from the adoption agency for the first few years, but after they closed, she paused, collecting herself. I tried to find you. After Karim's father passed, I searched everywhere. And I searched for you, replied with a watery smile. Through every recipe, every spice, every dish I learned to cook, somehow it led me here. You're cooking, Samira laughed softly. When Karim called to tell me about his wonderful new chef who made dishes that tasted like memories, I never dreamed, although perhaps my heart knew. Tell me, do you crush cardamom pods when you're thinking? Yes, Amira exclaimed. Elizabeth, my adoptive mother, always teased me about it. She said I left a trail of spices wherever I went. Karim watched them, seeing the similarities he'd missed before. The same graceful hand gestures, the identical way they tilted their heads when listening. His mother's features, softened and transformed, lived in his sister's face. The necklace, he said suddenly. That's what started all this. Amira recognized it from her photograph. Samira touched her throat reflexively. I couldn't bear to part with it completely. When I had to give you up, she looked at Amira. I kept it as a promise to myself that someday, somehow, I would find a way to reunite our family. Your father, again to Karim, found it years later. The argument that followed, she shook her head. After that, I hid it away. I never thought it would be the key to bringing us together. Marcus appeared discreetly in the doorway. Pardon the interruption, but Mrs. Hassan is on the line. She's quite eager to speak with all of you. Amira looked uncertainly between her birth mother and brother. Karim nodded encouragingly. Put her on speaker in here, Marcus. It's time all our family met. The next hour passed in a blur of emotional conversations. Elizabeth Hassan's warm British accent filled the room as she shared stories of Amira's childhood, her voice cracking when she thanked Samira for entrusting them with her daughter. Plans were made for the Hassans to fly out the following week. Your father would have loved this, Elizabeth told Amira. He always said you had the soul of a poet, the way you could describe flavors and create new dishes. Now we know where that came from. Samira wiped fresh tears at these words. Abdullah's gift, she whispered. It lived on in you. As evening approached, Marcus coordinated with the staff to prepare guest rooms. Neither Samira nor Amira could bear the thought of separating so soon. The mansion that had once felt too large to Karim now seemed to embrace them all, its spaces filling with the warmth of family. In the kitchen, Amira began preparing dinner, but this time Samira joined her. Karim watched from the doorway as his mother and sister moved around each other in a graceful dance, sharing techniques and family secrets. The surveillance cameras still recorded silently, but now they captured something precious, the rebuilding of bonds that time and circumstance had failed to break. I used to dream of this, Samira confessed as she showed Amira how to fold the delicate dough for her special baklava recipe, teaching you our family's dishes, sharing stories over simmering pots. Sometimes I would cook your father's favorite meals just to feel close to you both. Both, Amira asked. Abdullah loved Manakish with extra za'atar, Samira smiled. He said it helped him write better verses. And Karim's father, your lamp Hafsa, was his greatest joy. The evening light faded into dusk, and the kitchen filled with the aromas of generations of love expressed through food. 3 places were set at the family table, no longer separated by secrets or silence, but united in the simple act of sharing a meal together. The week that followed brought changes to the mansion that went far beyond its physical spaces. Karim had contractors convert the East Wing into a private apartment for Amira, while Samira took up residence in the family suite she had once occupied years ago. The kitchen, already Amira's domain, became the heart of their healing. Each day brought new discoveries and connections. Samira pulled out old notebooks filled with recipes and poetry, sharing the stories behind each entry. She showed Amira a collection of pressed herbs she'd kept from Abdullah's garden in London. Their fragrance long faded, but their meaning still potent. He grew za'atar on his tiny balcony, she recalled, touching the dried leaves gently. Said the London weather wasn't ideal, but poetry required persistence, just like your cooking, Habibi. Karim found himself leaving his office earlier each day, drawn to the kitchen where his mother and sister experimented with fusion dishes that combined traditional recipes with modern techniques. The surveillance monitors in his study gathered dust, forgotten in favor of real connection. One afternoon, as Amira taught Samira how to make a contemporary twist on keyboard, Karim received an unexpected call. "Mr. Al-Rashid," a familiar voice said, "this is Thomas Kent from the Adoption Agency's archives. You asked us to search for any additional records." Karim's heart raced. "Yes, did you find something?" "A letter," Thomas replied. "It was misfiled years ago. It's addressed to Amira from her birth father. It was supposed to be given to her on her 18th birthday, but when the agency closed, within hours a courier delivered a yellowed envelope to the mansion." Karim gathered his mother and sister in the living room, placing the letter gently in Amira's trembling hands. "You don't have to read it now," Samira said softly, "or ever if you don't wish to." But Amira carefully broke the seal, unfolding pages filled with elegant Arabic script. As she read, tears fell onto the paper, but she was smiling. "My dearest daughter," she translated aloud, "I write this not knowing if you'll ever read it, but hoping that someday these words will find you. Your mother and I shared a love as brief as a shooting star, but just as brilliant. When she told me she had to return to her life in Saudi Arabia, I understood. Some loves are meant to create beauty and then release it into the world. You are that beauty." Samira pressed her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob. Karim moved closer, providing silent support as Amira continued reading. "I've enclosed a poem I wrote the day I learned of your existence. Your mother loved poetry, and I hope you've inherited that love. Whether you know me or not, know that you were born of love and poetry, of sunrise walks through London parks and prayers whispered over cups of mint tea." The letter continued, full of tender words and verses that painted a picture of a love story that, though brief, had created something lasting. Abdullah had written about his hopes for his daughter, his faith that she would find her path in life, and his prayer that she would know joy. "He never knew," Samira whispered. "I tried to find him years later, but his family said he had moved to America. They didn't know where." She paused, then added softly, "He was right about you inheriting his love of poetry. Your recipes are poems in themselves." That evening, the family gathered in the kitchen. Amira pulled out her own notebook of recipes, showing them how she'd written each one like a verse, with notes about memories and emotions, alongside the ingredients. "I want to find him," she said suddenly, looking between her mother and brother, "not to disrupt anyone's life, but just to thank him. To let him know his words reached me." Karim squeezed her shoulder. "We'll help you together." He turned to his mother. "No more secrets in this family. No more walls." Samira nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Together," she agreed, "as we always should have been." As night fell over the mansion, the kitchen filled with the aroma of cardamom and orange blossoms. Amira taught them her special recipe for kunafa, one she'd developed while searching for her roots. Now, surrounded by the family she'd always longed for, she understood that every dish she'd created had been a step on the path leading her home. The security cameras captured it all. 3 people laughing, cooking, sharing stories, their shadows merging on the kitchen walls. In his study, the monitors showed empty hallways and quiet rooms, but Karim no longer needed to watch them. He had found something far more valuable than security. He had found trust, love, and the true meaning of family. The arrival of Elizabeth and James Hassan brought a new dimension to the already evolving family dynamic. They stood in the mansion's grand entryway, Elizabeth's silver hair gleaming in the morning light, James's kind face creased with emotion as they were introduced to Samira. "Thank you," Samira said, clasping Elizabeth's hands. "Thank you for giving our daughter the love I couldn't." Elizabeth pulled her into a warm embrace. "Thank you for trusting us with such a precious gift. We've watched her search for you her entire life." James, meanwhile, was examining the architectural details of the foyer with expert eyes. "Quite remarkable craftsmanship," he noted, his British accent precise. "I've designed similar elements in my own work, though never on quite this scale." "Father's an architect," Amira explained to Karim. "He specialized in blending Middle Eastern and European design elements. I always wondered if that's why they chose to adopt me. They already had a love for the culture." The two families merged seamlessly, sharing stories over elaborate meals that Amira prepared with both Samira and Elizabeth helping in the kitchen. The Hassans brought photo albums documenting Amira's childhood, her first steps, school plays, cooking adventures that often ended in delightful disasters. "Look at this one," Elizabeth laughed, pointing to a photograph of young Amira covered in flour. Her first attempt at making baklava. She was determined to get it right, spent weeks practicing. Samira traced the image with gentle fingers. Just like me at that age. My mother always said I was more interested in the kitchen than my studies. While the mothers bonded over shared memories of Amira's past, Karim and James found common ground in their professional interests. James's architectural expertise complemented Karim's real estate developments, and they spent hours discussing potential collaborations. But beneath the joy of these new connections, another search was beginning. Karim had engaged his best private investigators to trace Abdullah Rahman's path from London to America. The letter had provided new clues, mentions of specific cities, literary circles he knew about, publications that had featured his poetry. "We found something," Marcus announced one evening, entering the family room where everyone had gathered after dinner. A small poetry journal from Chicago published works by an A. Rahman until about 5 years ago. The editor remembers him well, says he taught creative writing at a community college there. Amira sat up straighter, her heart racing. "Chicago? That's where I did my culinary training. We could have crossed paths without knowing." "There's more," Marcus continued. The editor maintained correspondence with him. His last known address was in San Francisco, where he opened a small bookstore specializing in Middle Eastern literature and poetry. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. San Francisco was just a few hours' flight away. Abdullah Rahman, poet, dreamer, Amira's father, could be reached with a single phone call. "Should I?" Amira looked uncertainly at her mothers, both of them, the one who gave her life and the one who raised her. "Yes," they answered in unison, then shared a knowing smile. Samira added softly, "He deserves to know what a wonderful daughter he has." Karim already had his phone out, coordinating with his office. "I can have the jet ready in an hour if you want to go to San Francisco. All of us, together." Elizabeth squeezed her husband's hand. "We'll stay here, love. This journey belongs to you and your birth family, but we'll be waiting when you return." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation. As Amira packed a small bag, her hands trembling slightly, she found herself in her beloved kitchen, seeking comfort in its familiar space. To her surprise, she found Karim there attempting to brew Arabic coffee. "I thought you might need this for the flight," he explained, frowning at the copper pot. "Though I'm clearly not as skilled as you." Amira gently took over, adjusting the heat and adding the right amount of cardamom. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for this, for everything. For suspecting me, testing me, installing those cameras that ultimately led to all of this." Karim laughed, shaking his head. "I was so focused on protecting myself from potential threats that I nearly missed the greatest gift life could offer. A sister who carries our mother's spirit in every dish she creates." As the coffee brewed, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, they heard their mother's voice in the hallway, speaking quietly with Marcus about travel arrangements. The mansion that had once been a symbol of Karim's isolation had transformed into a true home, filled with the warmth of family and the promise of more love to come. The security cameras, still mounted in the corners, now served a different purpose, recording precious moments of family history rather than watching for deception. As Amira poured the coffee into delicate cups, she smiled at the nearest camera. "We should keep them," she suggested, "for memories." Karim nodded, understanding. Sometimes the tools we use to keep others at a distance become the very means of drawing them closer. And now, as they prepared to embark on another chapter of their family's story, those cameras would bear witness to the power of love to transform suspicion into trust, loneliness into connection, and separation into unity. The small bookstore in San Francisco's North Beach neighborhood was exactly as the Poetry Journal editor had described. A warm, intimate space filled with volumes in various languages, their spines creating a tapestry of colors along the walls. The scent of old books mingled with that of freshly brewed tea, and somewhere barely audible, Fairuz sang of love and longing. Karim entered first, his protective instincts still strong. Samira followed, her hand clasped tightly in Amira's. They found an elderly man arranging books on a display table, his silver hair catching the afternoon light that streamed through the store's bay windows. He looked up as they approached, and Samira's breath caught. Though aged, Abdullah Rahman's eyes were exactly as she remembered, deep, expressive, full of gentle wisdom. Those same eyes now gazed out from Amira's face. "Can I help you?" he asked, his accent a melodic blend of Arabic and American English. Samira stepped forward. "Abdullah," she said softly. "It's been a long time." The book he was holding slipped from his fingers, landing softly on the carpeted floor. "Samira," he whispered, gripping the edge of the table for support. After all these years, his gaze moved to Amira, and understanding dawned in his eyes. The resemblance was unmistakable. His eyes, his artistic temperament reflected in her bearing, Samira's grace in her movements. "Your letter found me," Amira said, her voice trembling. 30 years late, but it found me." Abdullah moved around the table with surprising agility for his age, his hands reaching out but stopping short of touching her, as if afraid she might disappear. "My daughter," he breathed. "My poetry made flesh." Karim watched as his sister stepped forward into her father's embrace, tears flowing freely now. Samira joined them, and for a moment, time seemed to fold back on itself. A young poet and a lonely woman in London, their brief love creating ripples that would touch so many lives. "Come," Abdullah said when they finally separated. "I live above the shop. We have so much to share." His apartment was a reflection of his soul, walls lined with books, papers covered in handwritten verses scattered across every surface, and in the tiny kitchen, a collection of Middle Eastern spices that made Amira smile in recognition. "You cook?" she asked. "Poetry is not so different from cooking," he replied. "Both require passion, precision, and a willingness to experiment. Both feed the soul." He paused, studying her face. "The Hassans, they were good to you?" "The best," Amira assured him. "They encouraged my love of cooking, supported my search for my roots. Their family too. Over cups of mint tea they shared their stories." Abdullah spoke of his years traveling across America, teaching and writing, always carrying the memory of that London summer and the daughter he'd never known. He showed them his poetry collections, including one dedicated to "My Unknown Daughter," verses that spoke of loss, hope, and enduring love. "I never stopped writing about you," he told Amira. "Every year on the date Samira told me you were born, I would write a new poem. 30 years of birthday verses for a daughter I could only imagine." He disappeared into his study and returned with a leather-bound journal. "These belong to you now." As Amira read through the poems, her tears falling onto pages filled with her father's elegant script, Karim noticed something remarkable. The way Abdullah arranged his books, his spices, his manuscripts, it mirrored exactly how Amira organized her kitchen. Some bonds, it seemed, ran deeper than shared experiences. "Your bookstore," Amira said suddenly, looking up from the journal. "It needs a cafe. A place where poetry and food can come together. Stories can be shared over dishes that speak of home and love." Abdullah's eyes lit up. "You would consider we could collaborate," she suggested, growing excited. "I could split my time between here and Los Angeles. Karim's jet makes the journey easy. This way no one has to lose anyone again." Samira touched her daughter's hand. "A beautiful idea. Bringing all the pieces of your life together, just as we've brought our family together." They stayed late into the evening, sharing memories and making plans. Abdullah read poems from his collections, his voice rich with emotion as he shared 30 years of love stored in verse. Amira described dishes she wanted to create for the cafe, each one inspired by a different poem. When it was time to leave, Abdullah pressed the journal of birthday poems into Amira's hands. "There are still empty pages," he said softly. "Perhaps we can fill them together now, with verses about finding instead of losing, presence instead of absence." In the gentle San Francisco twilight, Karim watched his sister embrace her father once more. His family had grown in ways he could never have imagined when he first installed those security cameras, suspicious of a new chef's motives. Now those same cameras would record the joy of future family gatherings, celebrations that would bring together the Hassans, the Al-Rashids, and Abdullah Rahman, all connected by love that transcended time, distance, and circumstance. 6 months had transformed both the mansion in Beverly Hills and Abdullah's bookstore in San Francisco. The bookstore now featured an intimate cafe called Verses and Spices, where Amira's culinary creations complemented her father's poetry readings. In Beverly Hills, the once austere mansion had become a warm family home, with the security cameras now capturing joyful gatherings rather than suspicious observations. Elizabeth and James Hassan had relocated to Los Angeles, purchasing a charming house just 15 minutes from the mansion. James was collaborating with Karim on a series of cultural centers that would combine Middle Eastern and Western architectural elements, while Elizabeth spent her days either helping in the mansion's kitchen or assisting at local refugee centers. "It's remarkable," Elizabeth commented one morning as she helped Amira prepare for a special family gathering. "How love can multiply without diminishing. I was worried at first, that finding your birth family might mean losing you." Amira paused in her preparation of saffron rice to hug her adoptive mother. Instead, everyone gained a bigger family. More love, more connections, more people to cook for. The gathering they were preparing for would bring together all branches of their expanded family. Abdullah was flying in from San Francisco, where he split his time between the bookstore cafe and teaching creative writing at a local college. Samira had invited Aunt Fatima from Saudi Arabia, along with other relatives who had long been kept distant by old secrets. "The table settings need to be perfect," Amira mused, arranging flowers with the same precision she used in plating her dishes. "It's the first time everyone will be together." Karim appeared in the doorway, looking relaxed in casual clothes, a marked change from his former formal business attire. "Need any help? You can arrange the seating plan," Amira suggested with a smile. "You're good at organizing things." As Karim worked on the seating arrangements, fitting together the complex puzzle of family connections like pieces of an intricate mosaic, he reflected on how much had changed. The cameras that had once been tools of his distrust now served a different purpose, recording precious family moments for a documentary Elizabeth was creating about their remarkable journey. The afternoon brought the arrival of their guests. Abdullah came bearing new poems inspired by his reunited family. Aunt Fatima arrived with boxes of traditional sweets and tears of joy at seeing her sister so happy. The mansion's rooms filled with conversation in multiple languages, Arabic, English, and the universal language of love expressed through food and family. In the kitchen, Amira orchestrated a feast that told their family story through food. Each dish represented a piece of their journey. Traditional Saudi recipes from Samira, British Middle Eastern fusion dishes inspired by her life with the Hassans, poetic presentations that reflected Abdullah's influence, and new creations that spoke of unity and connection. "My daughter," Abdullah said proudly as he watched her work, "you write poetry with spices and herbs. And you season your verses with love," she replied, embracing him. Samira, watching them, felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. "Allah works in mysterious ways," she said softly. "What I thought were my greatest mistakes became the path to our greatest blessings." The security monitors in Karim's study showed scenes from around the mansion. James and Karim excitedly discussing blueprints in the library, Elizabeth and Fatima exchanging family stories in the garden, children of various relatives playing in the courtyard. Every screen displayed moments of connection, of family bonds strengthened and renewed. As evening approached, they gathered around the enormous dining table. Karim's seating arrangement worked perfectly, creating natural conversation groups while maintaining a sense of unity. The feast Amira had prepared was served family style, encouraging sharing and interaction. Abdullah stood to read a new poem he'd written for the occasion, his voice carrying the weight of years of longing now fulfilled. "At this table of abundance, where love flows like honey, we gather. No longer fragments, but a tapestry of hearts, woven together by time and truth. Each thread essential, each color bright with joy." As he read, Amira moved around the table, serving her special dessert, a fusion of Middle Eastern and Western traditions that represented their blended family. The security cameras captured it all: the tears, the laughter, the embraces, and most importantly, the love that had transformed suspicion into trust, separation into unity. Later that night, as the family relaxed in the garden, Karim found his sister standing by the fountain, lost in thought. "Happy?" he asked, though he knew the answer. complete," she replied. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely whole." Above them, stars twinkled in the California sky, witnesses to a family's journey from suspicion to love, from separation to unity, from loss to wholeness. 1 year to the day after Amira first entered the mansion as a chef, the family gathered for another celebration. The security cameras that had once watched her with suspicion now recorded a very different scene. The grand opening of the Al Rashid Cultural Center, a magnificent building that combined James Hassan's architectural expertise with Karim's vision for bringing communities together. The center housed a cooking school where Amira would teach traditional Middle Eastern cuisine, a poetry center under Abdullah's direction, and a family advocacy organization run by Samira and Elizabeth that helped connect adopted children with their birth families. The building itself was a testament to unity, traditional Arabic architectural elements blending seamlessly with modern design, just as their family had blended together. "Did you ever imagine this?" Karim asked Amira as they stood in the center's main hall, watching their extended family mingle with community members. "When you first came to the mansion," Amira smiled, adjusting her chef's jacket emblazoned with both the center's logo and that of her San Francisco cafe. "I imagined finding my birth family," she admitted. "But this? A brother who tests people with open safes? 2 sets of parents who love each other like old friends? A cafe where poetry and cooking create magic together? Never." The center's opening ceremony brought together all the threads of their story. Abdullah read poems while Amira's students served dishes inspired by his verses. James proudly gave tours of the building's architectural features, while Elizabeth and Samira shared stories with prospective clients of their family advocacy program. "You see," Aunt Fatima said to Karim, watching it all with satisfaction, "Allah's plan is always greater than our own. Your suspicion led to discovery, which led to healing, which led to this place of unity and hope." The security cameras that Karim had installed throughout the center served a new purpose now, not to watch for theft or deception, but to record success stories, to capture moments of families reunited, of cultures bridging, of love multiplying. In the center's state-of-the-art teaching kitchen, Amira had hung a framed photograph, the security camera image of her first encounter with her mother's necklace. Beside it hung the necklace itself, now a symbol not of loss, but of connection, of family bonds that transcended time and circumstance. "Life writes the best stories," Abdullah observed, standing before the display, "better than any poet could imagine." As evening fell, the family gathered in the center's rooftop garden, surrounded by herbs reminiscent of Abdullah's London balcony and spices that spoke of Samira's Saudi Arabian kitchen. The Los Angeles lights twinkled below them like earthbound stars, and the scent of cardamom and orange blossom drifted on the breeze. Karim watched as his sister moved among their guests, confident and joyful, so different from the guarded chef who had first entered his mansion. His mother's laugh rang out clear and true, no longer haunted by old secrets. His brother-in-law, the poet, shared stories with James Hassan, the two fathers finding common ground in their love for their daughter. The security monitor in his office showed scenes from throughout the center, families sharing meals in the cafe, children learning to cook traditional dishes, poets and writers working in the literary center, all brought together by a story that began with suspicion and ended with love. "You're not watching the cameras anymore," Amira noted, joining him at the garden's edge. "You're living the moments instead." Karim smiled, embracing his sister. "Some things are better experienced than observed. Family is one of them." As if to emphasize his words, Elizabeth called everyone together for a family photograph. They gathered by the garden's fountain, the Al-Rashids, the Hassans, Abdullah, Aunt Fatima, and all the extended family members who had become part of their story. The security camera captured the moment automatically, but nobody paid attention to it anymore. They were too busy living their story, creating new chapters filled with love, trust, and the joy of being together. The mansion's cameras still recorded daily life, but now they captured celebrations instead of suspicions, laughter instead of loneliness, and the ongoing miracle of a family that had found its way home to each other. And in the kitchen where it all began, Amira's spices still told stories